Hello, everyone, and welcome to APQC's March KM webinar, a conversation about knowledge management and organizational culture. And when we survey our audience about the biggest barriers to knowledge management adoption and participation, culture is always at the top of that list. And culture is such an amorphous thing. It's hard to know what it even is, much less how to change it, how to influence it. But today, I really want to take some of those culture issues and topics head on and talk about how knowledge management influences culture and vice versa, how some of those cultural barriers are and how we can address them, and ways to build a culture within your organization that is conducive to knowledge sharing and reuse. So this is not going to be a canned webinar with a lot of slides and preset content. It's really designed to be organic and collaborative. And I've invited three fantastic KM practitioners and leaders to be part of this conversation. We've got Antonio Moneo Lane, who's from BBVA, Dana Tessier from Shopify, and Leland Holmquist from Microsoft. And Dana actually created and edited a book on this topic of KM and culture, the Handbook for Research on Organizational Culture Strategies for Effective Knowledge Management and Performance. And both Antonio and Leland both contributed chapters to the book. So I know all three of you have thought about this intersection deeply, and I know that you will have great insights throughout the conversation. So thank you all for being here. And I also have my colleague, Cindy Hubert. I asked her to join us. She's worked with many KM leaders over the years to navigate culture, figure out how to build the trust that is required to make KM happen. So the five of us here on the line can have a great chat, but it will be much better if, I don't know how that happened. Thank you for letting me know. The five of us can have a great chat, but, it'll be better if all of you online contribute. And you can do that in a couple of different ways. We've got some polls throughout the session. We've got the chat view, which you're already in, putting where you are and things like that. So feel free to have any kind of conversation, comments there. We've also got the Q&A panel. If there's a specific question that you really want the panel to address, then I would suggest trying to put that in the Q&A window as well so that we make sure that we see that. So I would like to move straight into this conversation if we can. And I was hoping that we could just go through the panel, starting, I think, with Dana, since you are the lead writer on this book, and have each of you introduce yourself, say a little bit about why you're interested in this topic, your experience with it, why you wanted to write a book or a chapter of a book about it, and I think that'll be great context for the conversation going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. So hi, everyone. I'm Dana Tessier, Director of Knowledge Management at Shopify. And as Lauren said, the author-editor of this great book about organizational culture and knowledge management. And I have long been a student of culture. I think what first clued me into the challenges with culture and knowledge management was something I was working on about a decade ago, where I was working in outsourcing and acquisitions and often transporting knowledge from different organization to different organization. And I found it so fascinating how something would work in one place and then completely fall apart in another organization. And so became really interested in why does this happen and how can we navigate this and circumvent it so that our knowledge management implementations can be more successful. And when I joined Shopify, I really got to see the benefits of a strong culture and how it really reinforced certain positive behaviors, but then in some cases prevented others that we needed to scale. So really fascinated by culture. And when the opportunity came up to dive into more knowledge management research, that's where I felt my time would be best spent. So yeah, it was really great to work with both Leland and Antonio and a whole host of other folks too.
Fantastic. Leland, do you want to go next?
Sure, happy to. So first, thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm really honored to be here with, KM professionals. And my name is Leland Holmquist. Friends call me Doc. I've been doing knowledge management professionally now since about 2007, which seems like just yesterday. For the past 10 years or so, I've been at Microsoft in the Industry Solutions Group, formerly known as Microsoft Consulting Services. I started as a consultant helping other organizations with their knowledge management efforts, implementing Microsoft technologies. And when I came to headquarters about 8 years ago, I was part of the team that transformed our internal knowledge management system to the cloud. And it's funny saying that now, because at the time that was so revolutionary, and now it seems, very ubiquitous. It's funny how things move. And as part of that transformation, I also helped our 24,000 plus members of our various global communities of practice move to new tools and ways of operating. For the last few years, I've been the communications and change management lead for the same group. And I'm still tightly connected with the KM team. So KM and organizational cultures are kind of the crosshairs of my professional passion, if you will. As a technologist, I spent years seeing programs with absolutely amazing technology that struggled. And when I looked at industry and some of the research that's out there, the struggles were even more shocking and pronounced. So like according to Vanini and Bouchard, only 1 in 6 CAM projects yields value within the first 2 years. And the majority, are considered failures. And 1 in 6, that statistic really hit me. It's just, really shocking that it's that bad. And so I wanted to do something about that, even in a small way. And from what I experienced, technology wasn't never really the core issue. And in addition, there's lots of people that are out there working to advance technical perspectives. So what I wanted to do was understand the human element and the motivations of our users. And we needed some psychology-based theories to provide a lens into some of the patterns that we observe in KM. So my quantitative research led to results that were contrary to the common sense, right? In ways that most of us have operated. And, good research sometimes reveals the most interesting things when we test assumptions that we just know to be true. And my research tested 2 theories, positive psychology and psychological contracts. And through these theories, we can have a vocabulary and framework that enables us to discuss what's really happening so that we can advance the science and art of knowledge management. So I'm on a mission to enable every person and organization on the planet to achieve more through the use of positive knowledge management systems.
Fantastic. And I'm going to ask you more, I know, about your research as we go along, Leland or Doc. And Tony, you want to tell us a little bit about your relationship to KM and culture?
Yeah, thank you, Lauren, and thank you for having me. It's a great honor and a great opportunity. I'm a KM professional. I've been working on KM for the last 10 to 15 years in different capabilities and in different organizations. Right now at BBVA, I don't work at KM department because we don't have one, but still, I'm trying to promote the practice within the organization. I've been always interested in innovation, open innovation, and how organizations innovate. And I've always been challenged by how these corporations, are forced to innovate because every year they need to adopt a new strategy. Today we have to become more sustainable. Yesterday we had to become data-driven. Before that we had to become more agile. Tomorrow there will be cryptos, digital assets, NFTs. There are, a constant challenge that we are going through, and that tells me that transformation is not something that a department should do. Transformation should be a core element of our practice, of everybody's practice. So we are constantly transforming. This is an ongoing challenge and effort that we have to go through. And then I found KM, and I said, KM is the solution for this, because we cannot buy all the knowledge that we need to adapt to the new world, because big firms of consulting firms, they try to bring external frameworks that they don't work for every company. We are not all of us are Spotify. We are looking at Google and all these wonderful companies, but most of us live with legacies and inertias from the past, and we have an embedded culture that we have to live with and we have to leverage. So I think my purpose in pursuing KM in my organization is I want to invite leaders to think, what do we have inside, what knowledge we have in the organization, so we can advance faster and define our way through this transformation. And it's basically building on what we have and what we know, because there's many talent in the organization that is sometimes never found, and it's totally untapped.
Fantastic. Cindy, do you want to just introduce yourself and say a little bit about your relationship to KM and culture?
I will do it, Lauren. Hello, everyone. I'm Cindy Hubert. And so back at the beginning of time, not quite that long, but back at the beginning of my time in knowledge management, our president, Carla Odell, now chairman, wrote a book with our founder called If We Only Knew What We Know. Catchy title, right? Fast forward to chapter 9, and it's called Culture, the Unseen Hand. And I was fairly new to KM back then and going, what does this mean? And a question was asked of Bob Buckman, who is then president and CEO of Buckman Laboratories. And the question was, what are the 3 critical success factors for knowledge management? And his answer was very simple: culture, culture, culture. And that really got my interest and has kept it for over 2 decades to say, how do we manage culture? How do we change it being the discipline of KM? Do we really think we can do that? So Dana, and Tony, and Leland, I'm looking so forward, because it's never been a topic that's died. It's evergreen. And to all of you, which you've said already, I think it's one of the most important things. So I'm glad we're tackling it again. I appreciate the book.
Fantastic. Well, I wanted to start off this portion because I want to talk about what are the barriers in culture and how do we overcome them by learning a little bit about the 120 folks we've got on the line here around whether you see the following cultural barriers in your organization. And you don't have to pick, you can select as many as you feel like are you see are significant for you. And these were the ones that were top of mind for me. People don't feel comfortable asking questions or talking about mistakes. They feel uncomfortable being vulnerable. People don't trust the information that's out there, outside of their immediate team or maybe outside their own personal laptop. Deference to leaders or experts or the hierarchy, discourages innovation, sharing, things like that. I see a lot of challenges in my work around measures that emphasize the superhero mode or the individual performance over the collective outcomes, or that maybe that, put people in competition with one another. And then finally, are there different cultures, especially if you have larger organization where they're just kind of not speaking the same language, either literally or in terms of their operational norms and their values and things like that. So we'll give people a few seconds to vote. I know that that's a mouthful, but I'm interested to see how prevalent some of these are in your organizations.
Lauren, I'm always glad to see the measurement piece in here. That's always an interesting discussion.
Yeah, that's one of my bugaboos. Okay, so really interesting. I feel like almost everybody is seeing those subcultures that are siloed with their own values, and we were having that conversation. It happens even in small organizations. I think sometimes people think this is you have to be a huge global organization to see that, but I think even with 20 people you can have a couple of different teams with different subcultures. And then a majority say people don't feel comfortable asking questions or talking about mistakes. And then 39% say measures kind of emphasize that individual performance. So definitely, along the line. But why don't we dig in on the subcultures topic? I don't know if anybody wants to take that first in terms of, how any ways that you can address those barriers around the subcultures.
I can share some of the findings from the research. So much of it does, as Cindy mentioned about measurement, right? So what are people being rewarded for? And if folks are being rewarded for their outputs and, you know, their personal metrics rather than perhaps team performance or team metrics, it's going to be difficult to have people stop and share their knowledge and help each other. And so leadership plays a huge role, both for identifying, you know, what behaviors are they going to reward, what incentives are they going to provide, what positive reinforcement can they, you know, provide when people are, you know, conducting the right behaviors, but also they can model those behaviors themselves. So demonstrating what does good knowledge sharing look like, what does good knowledge reuse look like, lessons learned, all of those right behaviors. Leaders have a huge opportunity to both model and reward that behavior.
Yeah, I think that's true of almost all of those barriers. If leaders are saying we care about this, they're role modeling effectively, you can build some of that into the culture. Anybody else have thoughts on the subculture issue? And people are posting about silos, and you know, nobody knows what other teams in the organization are doing. They're working on similar projects. You know, anything that you guys have seen that really works in terms of breaking down some of those operational silos and knowledge silos?
I think one of the things that, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Antonio.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think one of the things that I think is funny is when this comes up and I hear people talking about their culture, unless you are dealing with an incredibly small team, I always laugh inside because I don't think most organizations have a single culture. But here's the thing, we talk to it as though we do. And as soon as you start talking to things from a certain perspective that doesn't align with reality, then getting to a solution and you know, moving those behaviors and stuff becomes harder and harder because you're chasing the wrong target, right? So by acknowledging, hey, we don't have one culture, we have multiple cultures going on here. We have one ideal culture that we're trying to move to. Then you can start to identify, you know, how do the people in these other subcultures align to it, and what can we do to get them moving towards that ideal state, right? I think, Antonio, that goes a lot with what you wrote in the book, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for for the quote. Yeah, in our experience, I think there's one critical element. It's critical mass. I like to say, you know, when you have a large community, for example, we experienced this with a community of practice for data scientists. We knew that we were going to get a turnout of, 10% of participants in the community of practice. So if you have 100 people, you're going to have always the same 10 people, talking and sharing. But if you manage to create, and I'm speaking in the context of a very large organization, we managed to create a community of 1,000 people. So that 10% actually represents a critical mass that, I think for sometimes set the example for the rest. And that was a very interesting experience that I actually learned from other providers like Stack Overflow, etc. And the other key element for us was the leveraging the talent management levers that we call. So basically, you have to, build objectives around knowledge sharing, and you have to recognize very openly those who share the knowledge that is critical for the organization. And basically, we created a scientific committee to recognize those data scientists that were actually contributing and setting the example for the rest. I think recognizing the effort that individuals make at the organization is very, very important.
Lauren, I have a question for our panel. I'll start with Dana. If you have any thoughts on this, how do you think the move to virtual work impacted subcultures? Did it make it worse? Is it going to make it better when we come back? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. And it might be interesting. I don't know, Leland, I saw research that came out of Microsoft on silos during the pandemic. And if I recall correctly, there was more silos, but there was more inter-team communication. So in some ways, the turn to remote, it did kind of facilitate people collaborating with each other, but it may have made it harder to talk to people that you don't normally see in your day-to-day, and maybe those interdepartmental communications are more difficult. Personally, though, the return to virtual work for me has seen everyone's kind of on that same level playing field, right? Because Shopify went completely remote during the pandemic. So everyone is working from their home. We're not in like a hybrid working environment the way we used to be. So a lot more communication is being written down. We're being really thoughtful in how we want to share and communicate with each other, including, using videos or using, different means of sharing to make our sharing like, more interesting than just an email or a text or something like that. So for me, I think that it's helped capture more knowledge and share more knowledge, but I know there's been some other struggles depending on what tools people are using and how their organizations were set up.
Very good.
I'll agree with Dana, right? And like we saw the communication intensify, right? And days suddenly got longer too, right? But what I think is going to be really interesting is as folks come back to the physical setting more and more, will they lose some of what they learned, right? Will they kind of revert back to the habits that they had prior to being all remote, where maybe we didn't use those tools as effectively as we could. We weren't as inclusive and deliberate in how we use them. And I think that's something that we should all be on our guard against, right? And looking out for one another. So, you come back to a physical meeting, but one of your teammates is still remote, right? You need to help make sure that everyone is doing inclusive behaviors to keep that person included in the process as well.
Yeah, and I would like to add basically leverage on your content from the book. I think the elements of trust and psychology are really, really important. We're talking a lot about psychological safety in the organization, so you feel safe, and Leland, you know a lot about this, and building that community of trust, so you can share that knowledge and you can overcome these barriers, because there are different dynamics between teams and groups, and they are changing so fast that you have to trust your team to basically share what you know.
Yeah, I think trust is a super, super important thing. Dana, she wrote a whole chapter in the book about how important trust is for knowledge management. And I think that's really the backbone of any kind of knowledge sharing effort that we have. It's that trust element.
And Dana, I know that you have done a lot of work. You have a very high trust culture at Shopify, but you've also taken some proactive steps to create what you call system trust. So not just we have trust in the individuals, but we have trust in the knowledge sharing systems, the digital workplace platforms, the content and the expertise that you're going to pull out of that. Do you have any recommendations around, if you don't have that high trust culture, how you can build that?
Absolutely. I think a good starting point is to think about just how different tools and applications have changed how we live and work with each other already. For example, we all use Uber and get into cars with strangers, and whereas 10 years ago you would not be doing that, or taking candy and drinks from them. Like this is not what you were taught to do as a child. But Uber has through their app found a way to allow strangers to build really quick trust with each other and be able to engage in a personal and intimate exchange, and everyone is safe and happy and using that service. So thinking through that and applying that to your knowledge management system. So how can you demonstrate who is the author and what are their credentials or their bio or anything that can kind of help people understand the credibility of that source? How is this content being maintained? Is it up to date? We have in one of our tools a trust score. So you can see that this content is trusted and verified, what the last date was, who did that, any recent changes on the document, basically creating all of these different, components that help the reader understand, hey, this is content that is trusted. And so also they need to be able to find it. It needs to be discoverable. So really all of your content health and maintenance practices come into building system trust. And it's just about making those practices transparent to the audience so that they, can feel like this is good content and they should be using it.
Yeah, I feel like the visibility and accountability pieces are so critical there.
Absolutely.
So I want to ask, because I think that the second biggest barrier that people are experiencing is people not feeling comfortable asking questions and talking about mistakes. I don't know if any of you have any good advice there. I know this comes up a lot with lessons learned programs. People are usually more comfortable talking about their successes than their failures, and how you build a culture that where people feel comfortable doing that.
Yeah, I would say that it's all about promoting like curiosity and a learner's mindset rather than a fixed mindset. And so if people feel like they're going to be blamed for their mistakes and they're going to be, publicly humiliated or whatever negative experience might befall them for talking about the mistakes, of course they're not going to do it. But if mistakes are almost celebrated as, hey, wow, look at this new thing we learned, we're going to get better because of this, then that becomes a much more positive environment. And once again, I don't want to, put too much on leaders, but I still think that leaders can really model that behavior. And by sharing mistakes they've made and what they've learned from it, they kind of signal to the rest of the group that, hey, this is safe behavior to engage in, and this is how we want to approach our mistakes, and people will take that cue and follow along.
I think Antonio brought up a concept that ties right into this, and that's that psychological safety, right? It's knowing that I can put something out there. And it's not limited, by the way, to like mistakes and stuff. It can be things like you come up with a radical new idea, something that's very innovative, right? That same culture, that same psychological safety is required for you to be able to put that out there and, really, have an opportunity to let new things thrive. And leadership plays a critical role in that. Part of the key elements of trust are the consistency. So, when we talk about a mistake, for example, and we're doing maybe an after action kind of a meeting and stuff, do you have a consistent behavior, a consistent way of addressing it? Or, are you the kind of leader that, flips off the handle one time, another time is casual about it and takes the learning? And how are you driving your organization and the way that people understand it with consistency? I think that's a super important part to this.
Yeah, in my case, I hear a lot of people talking about lessons learned in the corridor, and I like to say that if this was a maturity model, we would be in what Leland was talking about, the campfire state. So people are sharing stories, but very informally, and I think we need to convince them that we have to build up and take those lessons learned to the highest level, so we can learn as an institution. We can really aggregate all those learnings and use them to improve our execution and our day-to-day. So, and talking about failure, I see people more open to talk about failure now than before, but still we are like in the TED Talks mentality. So we only share successes, and I'm really tired of that type of explanations. I think where you learn more is with when you talk and you share mistakes. One of the videos I always use in my presentations and classes is a video by Obama when he recognized the issues they had with the launch of healthcare.gov and the lessons learned that the government drew from that project were exemplary, and they are so useful for many other governments. And I think it's a great reference.
So there are a couple of comments in the chat around struggles with people who feel like knowledge is currency that they need to hold in reserve, and I think knowledge hoarding equals job security and problems like that. I feel like I've seen a lot of even very well-meaning knowledge management programs really struggle with that, even if that's not the intention of what's being put out there, but if that's kind of endemic in the culture. Does anybody have any recommendations for how you deal with that?
So I think this goes right to the heart of some of my research. So I mentioned the psychological contracts theory, and I'll give just a really brief overview of it. Psychological contracts theory is this really interesting theory where I'll use myself as an example. Between myself and Microsoft, my employer, there's a psychological contract, and it's a purely unilateral unspoken agreement that I have made with Microsoft. It's all the things that I believe, some of which go right to my core values, and it's unspoken. So it's the common things would be like, I believe it's, if I do an honest day's work, I should get an honest day's pay. Nowhere in any agreement, nowhere in HR did they ever say such a thing, right? But it's something that's, I believe, down deep. And as we look at these kind of things, when you have someone that's a knowledge hoarder, you want to say, why? What is it that's causing this, right? And one of the things that my research ended up showing that was really interesting was, I don't know about you, I'd love to see, every project that I had ever worked on in knowledge management, we advertised it to the users with very altruistic messaging. So we said things like, this is good for the company, it'll help our organization. Your knowledge is so valuable, we need to distribute it so that others can benefit from it, et cetera, right? And those are very positive messages. And we've always had the assumption that, that'll motivate people because they want to, right? And most of us are good-natured and we do want to help others, right? But there's an interesting thing. When we look at the psychological contracts of the typical knowledge worker, there are clauses in there that say things like, I'm valuable to my organization because of my unique knowledge, right? And so this ties down way deep down in us. And now suddenly I'm being told, well, take that unique knowledge and distribute it, make it available to everyone, right? And what does that do to me? It moves me out of that psychologically safe zone, even if I'm not thinking about it, right? Into, oh my goodness, I'm losing what makes me valuable. So if I lose what's making me valuable, what's going to happen, right? And I think a lot of those barriers that we run into stem from those kind of things. And we need to kind of flip that over and, stop messaging it from that altruistic perspective, but really get down into the weeds and what is in it for that knowledge worker. How can we get them to see the benefit from their perspective, not just the organizational benefit, but deep down in, how does it benefit them?
Yeah, I realized that you were giving me the perfect segue into this next question, which is really around what motivates people to share and use knowledge, and how we can tap into and foster that motivation. And I know your research speaks to that, Doc. Does anybody else have ideas for rewards, recognition, building that into incentives? Because I feel like that's where the rubber really hits the road. We've had some great comments in the chat around how important it is for the organization to put their money where their mouth is in terms of promotability and and rewards.
I've seen a couple of our internal groups at Shopify have linked contributing to the knowledge base as part of the requirements for advancement. And so really tying it into the promotion process. And when you're submitting your promotion, linking to, these are the articles and this is how I've contributed to the knowledge of the team. So that's a really kind of quick and easy example. But of course it requires that this is content quality, and that we're not going to see that get gained on the other side, and people contributing things that might not be particularly helpful, but when it's being monitored and managed, I think that's a really great way to do that.
And from my point of view, and also reading one of the questions that there is in the chat, in regulated industries like financial industry, for example, I was very surprised to see one of the directives of the Federal Reserve on model risk management, which was, a very interesting tool, because it actually calls banks to, create a repository of analytical models, and they have to be documented, etc. Because in many ways, regulation can help us structure these repositories, because it's right now, we have to be accountable for the analytical methods that we use and we embed in the algorithms. So by interpreting that regulation and, filling our repositories with analytical models and documentation, we are actually sharing a lot of knowledge. So On top of that, we developed some gamification strategies. We turned every data scientist into astronauts, and we made them travel through different planets, etc. We let them choose the adventure they wanted to live in the gamification strategy, and it worked pretty well. I think combining the regulatory framework and the gamification strategy actually makes it something useful.
So I feel like oh, Cindy, did you want to say something?
I'm agreeing with Antonio. I think you've got to have that integration of the compliance and regulatory frameworks with the discipline, because otherwise you just don't have anything to stand on. It's got to be melded together. So just agreeing.
And I feel like this is so hard because I think sometimes breaking into the measurement and reward system of the organization is one of the hardest hills for knowledge management to climb, and so I feel like this is where those partnerships with HR and learning and other groups within the organization become so critically important.
So there's another aspect to it too, and I completely agree with what you just said, Lauren. What my research also showed was so I looked at positive psychology as well, and positive psychology is the understanding of well-being. So it's like what makes life worth living? What can we do to become better and better, more fulfilled people, right? And there's a model in there called PERMA, and we use the PERMA model to measure a person's well-being objectively. And so what I did in my study was looked at it to see, would it predict behaviors of users in knowledge management systems? And it ended up totally did, but it did it in a completely different way than expected. So one of the parameters of the PERMA model is relationships. And earlier I mentioned, we always talk about how KM is good for the organization and each other and those altruistic messages. And, communities of practice and interest are such a key element to most knowledge management programs that I thought for sure that element will correlate and predict people's behaviors. And what we ended up finding out was there was no correlation whatsoever to that parameter. What did correlate was accomplishment. And that's the complete opposite. It's a very selfish motivator, right? And we look at things like rewards and promotions and those kinds of things, and those are absolutely accomplishments that can tie into this. But there are other things as well, and there's some of the little things. Sometimes it's a very small thing. Like I'll use an example. When I did the podcast with you before, I had a couple folks reach out to me from they weren't in Microsoft, they were out in other industries and across the globe. The fact that someone reached out to me was a huge impact on me. It was such a motivator, right? And it made me want to do more and participate more and help them. No gain to me from a money perspective. It didn't help me with my job, none of those kind of things, right? And as leaders, that's one of the things that I really want to get into people's heads is start thinking about these things and how can I use them? So like Antonio, you brought up the gamification, and gamification is one that I both love and worry about, because what I've seen is there are times where gamification is fantastic and it gets you what you're looking for, but sometimes you'll inadvertently create a very competitive and contrary experience. So I'd love to hear more from you on that, and what did you learn from that would say, watch out for these kind of things, but these things are going to make it a good experience for folks.
Leland, this is Cindy. I'd love to build on what you're saying. I wrote in the chat, one of my favorite books years ago was The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, because it forces you to break down what people do. We are creatures of habit, and how you do things so naturally and what motivates you to do that. And that was a great barrier breaker for us and our work at APQC, because it made us get down to the components of why people are doing what they're doing. And it's a good book still.
Yeah. Something else on gamification, and from my experience, I think it worked well when we had a very well identified set of users. So we used it in the community of practice of data scientists. So I think we were able to design a strategy that fit well with their expectations. And actually we involved them in the design process of this gamification strategy. So it was not something that we imported and implemented in the organization. We co-created the strategy with them. And then they decided the colors, the icons, the prices, the rewards, everything. So I think behind gamification, there is co-creation, which is very, very important. When you co-create a strategy, and KM strategies need to be co-created because we have to deliver what the user needs and wants in the way they want to have it. So I think those were two critical issues.
It's true, Antonio. Everybody thinks their own baby is most beautiful.
Well, and I think in our research, a couple of things that we've seen is keeping it simple. I think the more complicated the gamification gets, the more pitfalls there are. And people love those digital badges that you can earn, and that's, competitive with yourself maybe, but not as kind of, it's not about prizes so much as earning that recognition that people can kind of take forward and have on their virtual profile and things like that. So I think those things are really helpful. So I'm going to move us to our second and final poll here, because I want to spend a little bit of time talking about disruption. We've all experienced, I'm sure some perfectly normal last few years, right? No disruptions. And how you feel like disruptions, whether they're external, like a global pandemic, or internal, like a digital transformation, a reorganization, business transformation project, how all of those things have, affect KM in your organization. And again, you can select any of these that you've seen. I think sometimes it really causes the organization to double down on knowledge management. Leaders realize the need. People can't find anything. They have urgent knowledge needs. So there's a grassroots push for KM. But then we also see sometimes leaders kind of roll up the drawbridge, and they say, oh, we got other big problems to deal with. We're not going to spend as much time on knowledge sharing and reuse. Or people just don't have the bandwidth, the energy to kind of invest in it. And I also put, maybe you just didn't see a huge connection between disruption and KM, so you can choose that as well. And I do want to say a lot of people are suggesting some great books and references and stuff like that in the chat. I will compile a list of everything that was recommended and put that in the follow-up to the webinar as well, because there's a lot of great recommendations. I don't want people to be spending time scribbling those down and things like that. So people are seeing a lot of different experiences of disruption, but the biggest one is exhausted, overstretched employees had less energy to devote to KM, and I think that makes sense to me. And then almost as high, leaders realize the need for better KM. So I think that's an interesting combination. I see that reflected in our research. I think there's more top-level support for knowledge management than ever before. And not that employees don't see the need, but people are feeling stretched pretty thin. So I think some of these culture issues, the rewards and incentives issues, the change management issues become even more critical in that kind of environment. But I wanted to move and talk a little bit more about this particular issue and just ask the panel what their experience of this has been in terms of disruption or rapid change affecting organizational culture and how KM should adapt. I think we talked about that a little bit earlier with the remote work, but I don't know if people have additional thoughts, and especially around things like digital transformation or huge change initiatives within the organization.
Yeah, I can weigh in on navigating rapid change for sure. So being part of a hypergrowth organization, we have a lot of experience, a lot of internal change and a lot of, rapid acceleration of certain projects or pausing of others, in favor of other outcomes. And for me, my best advice for navigating that is to really focus in on either, the North Star of what we're trying to do or the why. Because what I found is that often the why or the big problem we're trying to solve hasn't actually changed. It's maybe just how we want to do it or when or some other nuanced details, but usually the core values that existed at the project from the onset have remained the same. And so that helps me kind of ground myself in, okay, well, it's still super important that we, deliver the best customer experience, or that we make sure that, these departments are connected through a common knowledge repository or whatever it happens to be. And then it's just identifying what are the other elements that have changed and how are those impacting the project. And then if we're finding, the values have changed and actually no, customer experience is not as important as it was before, and now we want to look at cost or security or some other factor, then that can also help guide you and realize, okay, well, if that's changed, what are the cascading effects and what are the other areas, and just kind of recalibrate and then make a new plan to move forward. So that's worked for me these past 7 years in hypergrowth, and hopefully that's helpful to others. But I'm sure there are many other ways to navigate this as well.
I think it's interesting because if you, so I'm going to talk about Microsoft, of course. When we look at the pandemic and you look at like our earnings reports, you see that our sales skyrocketed, right? Folks were suddenly very into digital transformations and coming to us for help and the technologies and stuff. But from an organizational culture perspective, the thing that I think is interesting is you saw through the pandemic organizations that we saw at both ends of the spectrum, right? You saw organizations that couldn't deal with moving forward and closed, right? They lost their business. And at the other end, you saw companies and organizations that absolutely thrived. And what I would love to see is a little study done and see, I'd be willing to bet that part of that equation was organizations that have more of a growth mindset and have that resilience built in, and they're willing to adapt and move forward, versus those that were, more fixed mindset and just looking at, this is how we've always done it, and we can't move forward. Our baby's been taken away, basically, right? So I think that there's an element of that I would intuitively, I think, is there, but I would love to see some proof on it.
And then you're reminding me of some early findings I saw from some internal research. And we were seeing that folks that were engaging in experimentation had a lot more resilience in the face of change than others that didn't feel like they had access to that experimentation. So that could also be another way to navigate this change. It's like, okay, if everything's changing, what can we try quickly? What's kind of freed up to innovate where we couldn't before? And that can also be a way to see, then you get into more of like, let's try and see. It's more creative rather than more of that fixed mindset space, which can feel threatening and distracting in the face of rapid change.
I totally agree, Dana. I feel like one of the challenges is that a lot of organizations have said that, but then you still have the same annual objectives that are based on these core things. And I see those things colliding, to our conversation about incentives and rewards. But Antonio, you've done a lot of work with transformation teams and things like that. How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, so I would like to build on something that Lauren said, and that is very, very important. And now it's the why of everything. We are creating one concept about one life. People realize that there is one life. There is not the work life and the personal life. It's all the same thing, and purpose is becoming more important than ever. And I think knowledge management, has traditionally been aligned with aligning practice throughout the organization, but right now, the big change would be to use KM to align the purpose. So, for example, I discovered the concept of community of purpose. I had never used it. And I think it is really useful in these terms, because if you talk about the practice, people won't find, I think, the motivations that we are looking for. But when you talk about purpose, people will really feel motivated to participate. For example, right now, we're starting the sustainability transformation strategy. And I have worked in sustainability before, but the organization doesn't know that I have that knowledge. But I'm willing to chip in, and I'm willing to participate, but the organization is not calling me. So I think if the organization is able to mobilize all that knowledge by building these communities that are a little different than communities of practice, they will be able to navigate better these enormous transformations that are happening every day.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think communities of purpose give some structure to some of those conversations that can feel a little bit amorphous to people. So I think that's a really exciting way to use the tools of knowledge management for transformation. So I wanted to, I think, move to a couple of audience questions because we've got a few minutes left here. So the first one I wanted to cover is, do you have any recommendations on how to break individualism and non-collaborative centric that is common in the Asian working culture that this person is experiencing? But I think it can probably be anywhere, just how you kind of deal with people who have that individualistic spirit, or where that's kind of central to the culture. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I would ask if it's possible to orient to more team-wide metrics, so that, you know, when the team wins, the individuals win rather than the other way around. You know, like Lauren mentioned, sometimes it is difficult to change those incentives and those metrics, but if there's any way to kind of orient the team and have them working collectively toward that goal, that like collective mindset, that community mindset, that would be, and showing that that's the behavior that's going to be rewarded versus the individualism, then I think that would be the best way to go about it.
I'm going to echo that. It's really about getting into their individual motivations, right? And understanding, where are they now and where do you need to get them to? And then figure out, you know, what remediations can we put in place? What therapies, if you will, can we put in place to move them down that, move them towards the behavior that you're looking for. If the person wouldn't mind coming off mute, maybe they can give a little detail on what they're experiencing.
Yeah, I don't know if I have that capability, but if you can put some more context in chat, I think we could definitely cover more of that. I feel like sometimes, again, the measurement piece is hard, but even in the spirit of experimentation, seeing if you could get a subset of the organization to do a pilot with some different measures and see if you can test some of those outcomes. I feel like people are adopting Agile, the organizations are understanding those concepts more, and you may be able to get some traction for an experiment, even if you can't get people to change their whole measurement philosophy overnight. So I wanted to ask one more question, probably just have like a couple of minutes, around the experience incentivizing partner organizations like learning and development, operational excellence, and HR to be advocates for KM when they have competing tools, processes, and programs to choose from. So I don't know if any of you have any good advice about kind of partnering with those groups and having an integrated approach.
I'll throw something out there, and then I bet Antonio will want to join in. So from a change management kind of perspective, right, I would flip that over. It's not about, getting them to see why the KM is valuable. It's the other way around. It's we want the KM to be valuable to them so that they partner, right? It's getting them onboarded and brought into the solution. Not asking them to do it after the fact.
That's good advice.
Yeah, from my perspective, I've seen that you have to really align these levers, and they have to work well together, because it creates noise to the employee if you don't align all your KM tools independently of who is sponsoring them. So, you start creating roles in the community of practice, and then communities of practice, and and then you create a lot. You can create a lot of entropy. So basically, we have to be very careful, and I think this is why KM as a program makes sense in an organization, because it has to be a facilitator, a coordinator of all these applications. And at the end of the day, these are messages that we are getting to our employees, and it's very important that they are all aligned, so and people understand what we are trying to communicate.
Yeah, and looking for those close partnerships with the groups that align to your purpose and what you're trying to do with knowledge management. I've seen it everywhere from IT to learning to innovation. It kind of depends on what the flavor of knowledge management and the goals that you have at that moment. And I think those partnerships can be fluid. So I think that we are going to have to end it there. I appreciate everybody on our panel, Dana, Leland, Antonio, Cindy, for being here. I want to make sure that we get a chance to share the book that Dana edited and Antonio and Leland that you've contributed to. This is the link. You'll get the slides, and you can click it from there, or you can search for it. And then we've got a discount code on here for a 50% discount on the book, so make sure you utilize that. I also put some APQC recommendations around KM and culture, if you want to dig further into this topic, and then if you get down into the pieces we've talked about, whether it's change management or transformation or rewards, we've got lots more resources and good things if you are looking at something like gamification or something like that. So feel free to get in touch with me if you want some more specific recommendations. We have some events coming up. Our Knowledge Process and Knowledge Management Conference is coming up May 11th and 12th in Houston. If anyone's able to travel, we would love to see you there. We have a great lineup of keynote and breakout speakers. We are doing quarterly roundtables this year. We did our first one in March. We're going to have probably our next one in June, I think around KM measures and metrics. And then obviously our monthly webinar series, we've got some great things coming up in the next few months as well. So I hope to see as many of you as I can there. So you will get a copy of the slides. Please take the satisfaction survey. You can catch up with future and past webinars on the website. And I think that is it. Please connect with us, and I hope to see all of you next month. Thank you so much to everyone for contributing, and we will get follow up with slides and recording, and I'll probably also do a write-up of key themes and things like that that'll be out next month. Take care. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everyone.